We have a tremendous panel for you, very diverse in their experience and their responsibilities. So going to, first of all, just spend a little bit of time introducing the three external panel members to you. So going to start with Chris. Chris works for AWS. Take a few minutes, Chris, and just share a little bit about AWS that we don't know. There's a challenge.
Who doesn't know
and
AWS?
What you do at AWS. Chris.
So, hi everyone. Thanks for having us. Thanks for having me at this event. Second year, I'm looking forward to this discussion and having a really fruitful discussion with the team. So, what is AWS? AWS is a cloud computing company. We are about 20 years old, believe it or not. For a lot of folks, that's not that long a time, but in cloud, it's actually a very long time. So I'm part of our life sciences organization, which is about 10 years old, and we work with essentially our customers and industry, our partners, and our and startups and large pharma manufacturers. And within that organization, we've been really focused on supporting the life sciences industry and healthcare industry across the life cycle. So in that capacity, I am the business development and strategy lead for life sciences. When I joined about 4 years ago, I was probably the first industry-specific hire that we had for manufacturing, CMC, and supply chain. Since then, we've evolved, and now I oversee our innovation programs that are part of clinical development, process development, manufacturing, and commercial.
Thanks, Chris. Very different type of organization. Matt works for Pioneering Medicines, part of Flagship. So Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit about Flagship and your role?
Yeah, sure. My name is Matt Schultz. I've been at Flagship Pioneering for just over a year. For those of you who don't know what Flagship Pioneering is, it's a biotechnology organization that invents platforms. Flagship likes to say that they combine scientists, entrepreneurs, and capital to invent non-adjacent companies that address unmet need in various innovative scientific domains. Most notably, some of the companies in our portfolio are Seres, which filed an NDA this year for C. diff, as well as Moderna. I work with a pioneering business unit called Pioneering Medicines, which explores unmet therapeutic need across really an unconstrained landscape, and then works backwards from there to apply our bioplatforms within our portfolio to bring those product concepts to patients faster. And often that's done either through internal development work with our bioplatform companies, or there's been external investment from organizations like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, Novo Nordisk, and Pfizer most recently, where we'll go through an exploration process and move into development candidate nomination and IND filing. And we typically won't go past human proof of concept. And my role is the head of Digital Pioneering Medicine, so charting out the digital strategy for that organization, which is not very big, but very diverse. So I think it's a different scope of problems. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. And then finally, Devendra. Devendra comes to us from Thermo Fisher.
Anybody not know Thermo Fisher? A couple things I think maybe that you don't know about the company, right? It's a fairly large company, highly acquisitive by nature, about $45 billion now, grown from 10 to 45 billion in just about 10, 12 years. So extremely rapid growth. Did 50% almost of the world's COVID testing through the pandemic. Again, something that might not be known to a lot of people. Most people think about Thermo Fisher as an instrument company. Less than 20% of our revenue actually comes from instruments. So more than 80% of what we do now is actually non-instrument related. So reagents, consumables. We've got one of the largest e-commerce businesses, over $10 billion in the industry, and fairly large services businesses in the form of the acquisition of PPD, which gives us another $6 billion clinical trials business, and Patheon, which now has grown substantially to having almost 30 manufacturing sites globally, and another $6+ billion business and growing very well. So I think one of our executive VPs actually summarizes Thermo Fisher in a very simple way. Almost anything that a biopharmaceutical company does, we do. And so we kind of come at it from a lens of how do we actually work with you to solve those problems. because far too often we are likely to be doing those things internally as well. Within Thermo Fisher, we have a very interesting software, pure play software business, and I lead global operations for that. It's called DigitalCMC. Probably known to many of you through our deployments of LIMS across nearly 2,000 sites globally across a variety of industries. But that's probably what you most know of us from.
Great, thanks, Devendra. So I think just to start, you'll see a great diversity of experience and representation there, 3 very different types of company and 3 very different roles, and Yash. So let's kick in. We heard from the keynote last night how, master data management was described as foundational for digital transformation. And I think, again, Yash highlighted the McKinsey work this morning where they reaffirmed that as well. So we're going to start our conversation around master data management. And rather than start the conversation from the point of view of where our colleagues work today, they've all had a very significant and varied career getting to where they are today. So I'd like them to take a sort of personal point of view, their journey, their career journey around data management. And what is their own personal experience around data management in this industry over the last 10, 20 years? Maybe, Matt, do you want to start?
Sure. I've only been at Flagship for just over a year. Before that, I was leading a digital biomanufacturing application team at a CDMO startup called Resilience, and then before that, I led R&D applications informatics at Alchemy. So, lots of different. I like to say that my background is applied IT.
Mm-hmm.
I have an undergrad in biology, and most of what I understand data management to be is on-the-job learning. Mm-hmm. And so I think in terms of like how we've transitioned over the years, it's often give me my technology to solve my problem without the necessary data modeling and foresight to think through how the business logic is going to be applied to technologies. I think Rob said in the last presentation, this idea of like digital transformation requiring this upfront design process. And so at Flagship, particularly at Pioneering Medicines, we're taking a lot of learnings from our companies. One company, who's a very sizable AWS customer, Generate Biomedicines, talks about getting good at one thing, and what they get good at is data modeling, and that's what we're trying to bring to Pioneering Medicines in particular. So I think investing up front in that applied master data management, using technology as a project or an initiative to bring a solution in addition to the governance that needs to come with it.
Yeah, perfect. And maybe Chris, different experience and background that you bring to this.
Absolutely, and I'd say there's some commonality. So I think the point you mentioned about applying yourself. So I've actually taken a different role. So as being in AWS, you'd probably think I'm the most digital technology-oriented person. I actually spent more time on the engineering and applied side, the application side of digital, and a lot of time around the different phases of the life cycle. So before AWS, I was with a company called Cytiva. It used to be GE Life Sciences. And in there, I had a chance to work across R&D, manufacturing, and supply chain, and essentially the intersections between that. So early in my career, I led different initiatives, programs around how we better manage data, how we leverage data to better drive tech transfer into our production facilities, especially when we would bring M&A in. How do we better drive better data management of their products, and how do we then integrate that into the broader manufacturing and supply chain? I had a chance to then take on roles where we were actually working within the industry, where we were building the manufacturing platform, the technology from the upstream scale, the seed train in the upstream, all the way through the cell culture, through chromatography, essentially an end-to-end platform, which we, from a manufacturing perspective, essentially built a platform that brought data from the sensors to essentially the historian, as well as the manufacturing execution systems. And then once there, you get to observe and you get to see a lot of the problems we talked about yesterday, which is data silos, throwing the data over the wall. How are we working across these silos? How are we improving the access to that data? And finding that the fundamental challenges is that foundational layer. So I've made it a mission of mine, I think, being at AWS, to work within the industry to help unlock some of those problems and help address some of those main challenges.
Pragmatic, yeah. And Devendra, your experience getting to Thermo Fisher.
Yes, it's been very fortunate to kind of go through a few different organizations over time, right? Both the kind of growth stage, Cambridge Soft, and then going into PerkinElmer, to the other side of the table at Merck, running research IT globally for Merck, and then back into diagnostics with Abbott and now Thermo. I think from what I've seen, it's a problem we've created, right? We've created over the last 20 plus years. Most people, again, sort of, won't see this, but if you talk to any R&D IT leader in most large companies and you ask them, how many applications do you run to support research, preclinical, or development, you'll come up with a magical number of around 600, or so. And what you then realize is that the attention span that whether it's the business or the technology organizations can spend on that is extremely limited. By design, we've kind of created an extremely fragmented ecosystem within these companies, and part of that tends to be, my science is different than yours, what I do is a little bit different than what you do, and therefore I need this system and I can't use your system, is sort of one lens that I've observed over the years, right? And I think there are specific parts of the industry where we have solved it. We have solved it in clinical. I think the money's there, to make it worth its while, and you've seen it being solved in the clinical space. You have solved it outside sort of the R&D space, perhaps more in diagnostics. If you go into a clinical diagnostics setting, you do see a far more standardized approach to how they do these things. So, I think that's one of the big observations. The second is, I think, I don't know if it's a lack of standards or if it's a lack of adoption of standards. We just haven't spent enough time kind of thinking about how do we do this, And if you look at it just in some of the last few years, right, CELA, animal, allotrope, you see a lot of these pop up, but almost none of them being adopted at scale. So again, just compounding the problem of data management and knowledge management.
Yep. We'll come back to standards in a little bit. It's quite a rich subject for us all to dig into. Just want to give Yash a chance for your own sort of personal journey getting to QbDVision and
yeah. So I'm the little person, I guess, in the mix here, in the sense that I've always been I've been a serial entrepreneur. I am a serial entrepreneur. This is my third startup at QbDVision. Prior to starting QbDVision, I was on the founding team of a company called Xeris Pharmaceuticals. And so I was on sort of your side of the table, right? I was managing pharmaceutical development as the chief operating officer there. And as we really got into the crux of scale up and optimization, as we were trying to get this ready as a phase 3 asset, we were just absolutely buried crushed by the inability to understand what was happening with our process because we just didn't have connected data. So as a chief operating officer, I had no visibility into the overall program. And so what would happen is somebody in the organization would start to pull on a thread about some piece of information and things would quickly unravel, right? Because, we ran a batch, there's an out of specification, okay, now what? Like, why is this the specification? I don't know, let's run over here and figure this out, right? What's the impact of this being out of specification? I don't know, let's call a meeting, right? So it's the standard practice, right? Call meetings, bring SMEs in, dive through lots of disparate sets of information. The amount of time we wasted that we couldn't afford to waste as a startup company, right, was really frustrating, right? When we had a partner want to come and look at our platform, right, they brought a CMC diligence team that was bigger than our entire company, right? And so here we are, again, going through this process of trying to, show some level of maturity in our program, but it's hard to do that when your information isn't consolidated and coordinated in a way that makes sense. So, when I left Xeris, I decided that I felt like we needed to build something for the industry, but we didn't want to be incremental about it. We felt like it had to be something big and bold, and that meant building a structure that can manage from end to end, right? So that base of the triangle that Rob was showing stretches across as many stages of the life cycle as possible. because that's how you seamlessly then connect information. If somebody says, well, why is this a specification? You can quickly see because the threads are already connected. You're not pulling on them in some manual, a difficult way to get that information. It's right there in front of you. That was the vision. And so that's what we've been focusing on the past 6 years, is to build that. Because what that then allows you to do is now you can build the workflows, and then you can automate those workflows, right? And that's really the overall strategy here.
That's great. Thanks, Yash. So obviously the idea of a panel is I hope you all see 4 very different experiences and career journeys are just around data management, master data management. So first opportunity to show that you all have a pulse. Do you want to dig into any particular journey or experience? Did you hear a nugget there that you'd like to ask probe a question about? And I can pick on a table at random if you want. Yes, please. I don't know if there's a microphone. This is your conversation, and I'm just trying to facilitate. So these 4 guys are sitting here ready to answer questions and dig into their experience and so on. So use the opportunity, please.
Thank you. So I'm David Hendravirawan from the University of Texas, teaching data governance. MDM is one of the topic that we cover in the classroom. And lately there's been a lot of buzz around generative AI, right? You've talked about that. But where do you see, are you seeing the potential for machine learning or Gen AI or even just AI to bring MDM to the next level?
Do you want to pose that to a particular panel member, or shall I randomly choose?
Just randomly choose, please.
Okay.
Well, Chris will just say, yeah, just put it on AWS, right?
which is exactly why I didn't give it to Chris.
You knew how that conversation was
Yeah, and it's inevitable.
I think there's a lot of organizational inertia that has to be overcome, even in like a startup ecosystem. So like a lot of the conversations we're having right now is centered around intellectual property, risk to our businesses in using generative AI, like ChatGPT, but we're also starting companies using generative AI. So I think there's this mix between how to apply it. What you can't overcome is, like what I mentioned, is applied master data management. So starting simple, especially when your organization early on doesn't carry that rigor or have that background. And so like one of the things that we've had to overcome is, hearing like our ELN is our source of truth, right? But that doesn't mean much when, everyone's just attaching every imaginable file, whether it be GraphPad Prism files or Excel files or FlowJo files, to their ELN without any sort of organizational structure or data governance. And those things, I think, come in conflict when you're trying to go fast. And so what we've tried to do at Pioneering Medicines is take some of our ecosystem products. Like, so we have one company that open sourced a study tracker tool. And it's very simple, but it's like basic master data management 101. What is a program? How do studies relate to programs? How do assays organize themselves across studies? And just get them thinking through that and building that business logic. And I think a lot of the problem that gets me excited, the problem that we want to try to solve that gets me excited about QbDVision, it kind of starts backwards, right? So I think that resonates with folks that work with Amazon, is kind of like working backwards. In research and filing your preclinical modules, that doesn't really happen. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit simpler to get to your preclinical outputs without necessarily needing to go through any level of standardization. So I think that's where there's a gap that we're trying to tackle right now.
Follow up? Yes. No? Good? I'm trying to see. Yep, there's one in the middle. Thank you.
Follow up to that question. The type of data you're talking about that would reside in an ELN, for example, traditionally I think is considered in a lot of cases outside a GMP envelope. Although it's sort of going in that direction of where now we need to have that QRM approach. You said that the data governance is important. How would you, or how do you enforce that? Is it through, say, SOPs that are now part of the QMS, or is it enforced by the software itself? What's the right approach to make sure everyone's aligned on those in a system that's as flexible as a ELN?
You won't get good compliance if it's forced downward, and I think just I didn't even mention data governance when we talked about why we're implementing our study tracking tool and integrating that across, unfortunately SharePoint is still involved, but the first step is just making sure that, when you log into manage your studies and your overall program objectives, you can find everything. And over time, we're going to grow, and that's kind of comes back to Rob's presentation around digital evolution and digital transformation, right? So we have a transformation strategy, but today, we need to track our studies. So that way, when they move into formulation development and start loading things perhaps into QbDVision, it's not like a retrospective archaeological dig.
I'll add to that a little bit. I think it's got to be grounds up, right? Not force top down in many ways. And going back to my days at Merck, I remember this is probably 2017 now, when we actually formed a group that was focused on data stewardship. And this was a group that was across various functions within the scientific organizations and IT, with the very specific design that if ultimately you want to be consumers of this data, what you would want that data to look like, what is the context at the point of capture, at the point of origin of that data, how are you capturing it, how are you preserving it, how are you percolating it throughout the systems. And if you don't do that sort of grounds up, right, you could have a whole bunch of SOPs and a QMS and still not get there, right? So it's got to be grounds up.
Yeah, we've got 2 more questions here. This is good.
I was just going to add, if you don't mind, I just want to add one more perspective to it, because it is kind of one of the topics I think that this session's really about, is just looking at from a different perspective, because I agree with both the responses here. Is from a perspective of what I see with AWS and the conversations we have with our customers, I'd say there's been different waves at which we've seen this evolution. So going from cloud is kind of a way to get out of your data center, to then, now that you're out of your data center, what do you do with the data? Well, you bring into data lakes, and very large enterprise programs have thrown a lot of data into data lakes, maybe data swamps is what we want to call it. But from a governance perspective, also took more of I've seen a lot of examples of taking a top-down approach to how we're going to govern this data without understanding what is the outcome that we're trying to enable, and why are we bringing these policies and governance into it. So I think we're kind of moving into this third wave, kind of bringing in that first question, which is driven by how do we move more towards, I'd say, intelligence, which is how to maximize the value of this data. That's actually driving the questions around the best way to do the bottoms up. It shouldn't be centralized. It should actually be distributed. What is the purpose of the use of that data? What are the conditions that we need to have in place to ensure those parts of the business are successful to deliver for the patients? And so I think what we're seeing now is that focus around the great, tremendous transformative value Gen AI has, is getting back to how are we going to govern that data? How are we going to make it easy to achieve those outcomes?
Yep.
And just to build on that, my question, thought, reflection is really exactly on the title of this session, is the connectivity between the data and knowledge. And to use your analogy, as a serial pharmaceutical scientist leader, the value of knowledge management itself is still an evolution. I mean, it's there in the ICH, is there in the regulation, but is it in the corporate way of understanding the value chain? And then there is, the vertical and the horizontal of it. But bottom line is the CMC path is all knowledge and knowledge and is knowledge evolution, is actually the life cycle management. Is an iterative knowledge process. But ultimately, it's not connected to the clinical journey and to the patient journey enough to see the value of the knowledge internally. So I think that's another connectivity that I was wondering from your experience. And I think at Thermo Fisher, you have that recent connectivity with clinical. Do you see something else that we can do from the CMC journey on the horizontal path to it to really look at 2 indicators that big pharmas are really looking for. So if you're looking at the press release, there are 2 times when something is mentioned big outside in pharma. When you have a new product on the market, right? So you have a new medical need, or you have something that was proving a milestone across a new disease. And the second is the time when you look at the benefits or the sales or the quarterly evolution of it, right? Mm-hmm. So these are the CMC path is something in between that makes this happen.
Yep.
Right? And we're all in, and we sense that something is missing, but it's too big of a distance between the clinical and the sales, right? So how do you see a path to using, in a new model, this connectivity that we're all talking about, connecting knowledge to business?
Yes?
I'll comment on a couple of things there. So there are, we are certainly seeing that, what is one of the things that can stop that train, right? And one of the things that can stop that train is data integrity and data governance violations. We are seeing it across the board where companies are basically, they can't launch, right? The agency says, you don't have control of your data, you don't have control of your information, so clearly nobody can trust it. We don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going on, so until you figure it out, you're not going anywhere, right? One biosimilar company went through 3 483s, and then ultimately got a complete response letter. Right now, how much is that going to cost them? Right? That's going to be very expensive, right? They think they'll get it done in 6 months. That's not the reality, right? It takes a long time to fix that problem, right? The next way that train can get stopped, you don't pass your pre-approval inspection, right? Now there is a 4th objective that the inspectors are specifically looking for, right? And that 4th objective spans the life cycle of, right? So I think there are some regulatory imperatives, right, that are going to start to change that conversation, right? Where clinical and CMC, all that needs to get aligned early on and start doing the right thing, because you risk falling off a pretty big cliff at the end.
And the next one actually is asking for exactly the same thing, the life cycle management of knowledge. So
Yes.
it's FDA is EMEA.
EMEA, right?
Yeah.
They're all going down that direction. Yeah.
Daniel, do you?
Yeah, so one of the observations is that unfortunately we have a vicious cycle between our industry and technology providers historically. The technology companies say you can save data, so save it. And the companies that say, okay, we're going to save the data because we can. Instead of actually looking holistically at what knowledge do I need, what facts do I need, and what is the appropriate data, information, knowledge that I need to gather in order to address that question. So how do you think we can break that vicious cycle that we currently have, where we store because we store data because we can?
Let's not have Yash answer this.
I will chime in though.
Devendra?
I mean, I think, so in terms of, you're right that, you can store the data, and the hypothesis some of the leaders, the scientific leaders have, it's not, I don't know that it's necessarily driven by the technology vendors. I think there's a mindset that the cost of experimentation is far more expensive, and you may not have all the tools today to interrogate the data that you have, but if you have collected it, if you have the right context captured with it, over time, as we're seeing now with Gen AI or whatever will be the next frontier, you can go back and interrogate that data. And so that's a big factor in why you're storing the data, right? In terms of what can you do with it. And I think you're seeing it applied particularly in chemistry, where you've got a lot of libraries that are going through more modern tools, through models, and being mined, so that you can actually derive something that you hadn't seen previously because you just didn't have the capability or the tooling. So I don't know that it's Amazon necessarily, driving that well, sure, you can store it. I think that just happens to be it's convenient now, and then the cost is going down further and further. But it's much more driven by, if I have to repeat that experimentation, if I have to redo that science, it's far more expensive to me.
I'll add to that a little bit, because I actually think this is a very important question. And I think in a lot of ways, we're still in a stage where we are just storing the data. And so a lot of conversations that I have with customers is about using all these different transport protocol communication standards to get the data, Do you have this protocol? Can you get the data? Can you get the data? And I think what I'm starting to see, and not enough of it, but I start to see some of these little pockets, maybe starting outside our industry. You know, for example, in consumer packaged goods, there are customers that are actually understanding the value of spending time contextualizing the data, working with new information models that can help bring that out before you bring the data in. You know, we talk about data lakes. Instead of having a swamp, you actually want to have a lake filled with distilled water. That's the value you can get. And I want to say it's not happening enough. I think there are pockets in large organizations where this is happening. There are standards, there's forums that are coming together with plug and play and how to think about how to connect devices. But I think more and more of this is starting to happen where the questions are being served. Are we just going to store the data, or are we going to spend some time to contextualize the data to bring the information models lower or push it towards the source systems even more?
I think it just centers around a human problem. You know, I think, you know, our organization is quite young, and we have a lot of talented drug developers that we've brought in that are completely satisfied with presenting and organizing their TPPs into PowerPoint decks and putting it in SharePoint. And I'm like, where does everyone else's anxiety when in 3 years we're going to have 4 or 5 clinical programs with different modalities? So why isn't everyone else freaking out about our process and technical debt that we're backing ourselves into? So I think that's really like where the focus is. And so like I spend most of my time educating and kind of, you know, bringing the folks in the leadership together, and then also trying to like look at the folks in the lab to say like, you know, this vision isn't going to satisfy your problems today, right? They're comfortable putting everything in the ELN. So there's like this, it's this very multi-dimensional problem that is mostly centered around people and process rather than technology now.
Final comment on this, Devendra?
Yeah, just one. I mean, I think, you know, so a lot of what we've heard and we've talked about, right, and so much interest in AI. But if you actually don't have all of that data, don't store it, how do you train the models? You know?
Yep.
But you need the contextualization.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's dig into another topic that I know, Devendra, you mentioned earlier on, and I want to get the panel's opinion on this topic, then open it up again. So the whole topic around data standards. We all have in this room very strong opinions about data standards built up over years and years of very bad experience. So, you know, how can standardized data models benefit more broadly? What's your opinion, and what's experience and sort of examples is that based on? And maybe I'm going to start with you, Yash, this time, so you don't interrupt them.
Well, I mean, in my presentation, we have a very strong opinion about that. Obviously, we had slides around what the hierarchy of taxonomy and ontology look like, right? But it's interesting because, you know, when you talk to people more broadly about knowledge management, they say, well, this is a very intractable problem. We have to sit down and roadmap it to figure out, you know, how should we provide context around the data? And, you know, our answer to that is that, well, there's one way that you absolutely have to provide context to that data. Right? There's one way that you will always have to do that work, and that is the context that matters to the regulators. Right? And so why not start there? We had this conversation right from the beginning, right? First time I met Matt, he's like, well, how can we have an open data model, blah, blah. And I said, well, we're not actually allowing that yet, right? Because ultimately the translation, whatever data model you have, the translation has to happen into the language that the regulators are going to understand, right? You know, if you're going to call something a key quality attribute, they're going to have no idea what you're talking about. You can call it that. That's what we call it within our organization. Fine, but at some point you have to figure out what is a critical quality attribute, right? Because they don't know what a key quality attribute is, right? So we started, when we were thinking about it, we said, well, if we're going to introduce a structured framework to the industry, what makes the most sense? What can we do that can't really be challenged, right? And what that is the ICH, the quality by design, that level of that kind of hierarchy, that taxonomy and ontologies, right, is always going to be there. So we just started there.
I love your laser-like focus on this and the simplicity of it. To be, sort of provocative, which is my role here. 30 years experience would tell me millions of dollars have been spent over different parts of pharma R&D, manufacturing and commercial, talking about standards and failing to develop standards apart from in a couple of places. So why is that? What is wrong with the industry? Because the benefits have been talked about yesterday evening and all morning. We're all waiting for that sort of language and that scale and reliability and so on that come from standards. So what's wrong with the industry? What's in our way? Maybe start down this end.
I have the answers.
Well, you've got a new young organization that could act in a very different way and think about this in a very different way. That's why I think Flagship is quite, unique.
It's like caveman brain, because it's like we're solving the same problem over and over and over again with every new company we launch. And
So you could be the big.
it's that. Did you have the picture of the with the wheels,
yeah,
the square wheels?
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. That's what it's like being in Flagship sometimes. It's sometimes I think, and it's a different conversation with small companies versus established organizations, because you don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to pick that data model, and then start building technical debt around that data model. But I think that's why, the idea of QbDVision, I think, excited not only myself but the team that we're working around, because we basically can work backwards from there. We know that we have to scale this over and over for programs. I think, honestly, I think that the challenge with the industry is the diversity of research. I think one great bright spot is kind of like the standardization of genomic sequencing data, and that's really sped up, I think, the progression of how we innovate. But in other disciplines, those standards don't exist, and so we often, I think, the CMC teams end up being maybe victims of the research counterparts.
Chris?
I think I just want to kind of come back to some of the topics that were in your presentation and yesterday with Dan and his presentation, which is we're still in this situation where I think each of us are part of functions that think about our chevron and are not asking the question around how does this benefit the patient, or how is what I do in service of the patient. And we like to think, life science is complex, science is complex. What we do is very complex, and I'm not discounting that. However, what I'm saying is we use that as, I think, a reason to stay in those silos versus to pick areas and examples where we can get out of those. And for example, I see a lot of work going on in, say, clinical development, where, or CMC, we'll take, for example, CMC, a lot of the work that QbDVision is doing around looking at the data management component and aligning it to certain standards. I also see the same work happening in manufacturing. Surprising, it's not the same, how they're thinking about it. And I'm not sure it will be, to be quite frank. I'm not sure we're going to all sit here and agree on a common standard. It might be, though. I think you mentioned the Klingon and the universal translator. There are tools that can help us do that much more efficiently now. And there are very clear North Stars, like how can we get this molecule or therapy to the patient 2 years quicker? Or how do we connect these two silos so that we could better understand the efficacy within the patient? We have tremendous opportunity coming with new modalities. RNA, cell therapy, oligos are kind of making a return. So I think picking one of those areas and trying to identify what's the universal translator that we're going to focus on and demonstrate those. I think we're still trying to demonstrate our work in silos and not enough across.
That's a very good point.
The life cycle.
Devendra, have you got?
I think from my lens, a lot of what I think you have to look at is, how a vendor is actually driving that adoption of standards, right? Because I think, a lot of what we've done in our industry is we spin up pre-competitive programs and then try to kind of build these standards with none of the vendors necessarily embracing any of it. And so you don't really have a path to adoption of those standards. If you kind of ask, why has HL7 been successful, or why is DICOM successful, a lot of it is to actually do with the vendors that adopted it and then basically said, this is how you do it. In my own sort of experience, I think we've seen it, and you've seen it, Mike, with two companies, right, in the chemistry drawing space. One here in Cambridge, Mass, came up with CDXML as their standard for representing chemical structures and reactions, and another one came up with a mole file format, and ultimately both learned to work with each other. But what drove that adoption was probably 1 million users around the globe using those tools and saying, these are the standards we're going to actually end up using. And I don't think that's happened, right? I think Pistoia Alliance has tried with the ELN going back, 10 plus years, trying to have a standard for ELN data exchange, and those things don't work. So there's got to be a forcing function in my mind from a vendor's lens that makes interoperability easy with the standard, but also has a standard that puts it out there.
All good points. So let's
I'd like
open it
to-
up.
Mike, if
Chris
I can
wants
add
to
to that, sorry,
Yeah,
because
sorry.
I do think we talk a lot about the ecosystem, and I agree with forcing functions, and I really think we do as an industry have to think about where we want to drive that forcing function. Dan, I'm giving a lot of what you said yesterday reminded me about the sheepdog example. You mentioned standards in Pistoria. I know Bioforum's here. I'm going to be gentle. I really love that organization. I had a chance to host them last week. We're starting to finally see even those areas getting out of their swim lanes. Like, I think we need to see that. I think Bioform just came out with the BPOG manufacturing maturity model. Now it's just emphasizing the importance of thinking about CMC and quality along with what you're doing in your factory. And I think that has been there, but I think the more we see that, we can help drive, the ecosystem could start to force us in all these different ways.
Yeah, and I just want one more point too. I
knew
think
you'd do
as a
this.
vendor,
Yeah,
I needed to
hold the
interrupt
pen, hold
since
the
you
pen.
said since I needed to interrupt. But I think as a vendor, one of the things that we are also trying to say, which I think is different than other vendors a lot of times, is say, look, we don't think we have it all right? So to say that we pick the ICH QBD kind of standard as the sort of foundational layer of the taxonomy and ontologies is not to say that it's the end-all be-all. That's why I showed that hierarchy of, because you build on top of that. ICH built on top of those principles, right, so on and so forth. And so one of the things that we're also doing is recognizing that if you think about those different layers of the taxonomy and hierarchy, we have to internally be willing to translate into the other ones, right? That's all part of building the ecosystem. Because if we say, look, we're not interested in integrating with ISA, using ISA 95 as an integration to MES. If we're not thinking about, whatever other models that are out there, we're just not willing to do it, then we're stuck in our digital silo, right? So I think other vendors have to appreciate that there are schema mapping exercises you need to be able to enable, which we have certainly done, but it has to start with some level of structure that you promote, and then say, okay, we'll create the translators into these different languages to start to bring that together. Because I think ultimately what will happen is it starts to bring it all into one place and bring this connectivity, and then people can start to iterate around how do we create a common standard maybe that can be more efficient.
Great. Right, let's stop there with the guys on the stage. Where are the questions?
From your point of view, hi, this is Josh from Bayer again. From your point of view, who's going to driving these standards? Like, who's responsible for developing new standards? And if it's more than one, right? Like, who could that
Who
be?
is responsible for driving the standards? Let's have very briefly. That's the guideline. 4 answers. Yes.
We don't have a standards body in the industry, right? I think if you think back.
This is brief, by the way.
Yeah, I know, but if you think back to 20, 30 years ago, remember when I was first learning how to write software and connect software to devices, you had the RS-232 standard, right? Like that was on the back of every device. You knew how to communicate with that, no matter what you were doing. We don't have that, right? We have people still using ISA 88, which is a non-supported standard today, right? Like there's no body that governs it, but people still.
So the answer is?
Well, we need, I mean, I think if there's an opportunity for one of these groups like Bioforum or all that to think about, trying to drive a standardization or become a standards body, that would certainly be very helpful.
Devendra?
I think from my lens, it has to be the technology vendors. Ultimately, what you all consume, biopharma companies consume, is technology from a vendor. So at the end of the day, if that's what you're buying, that's what you're deploying, then whoever is the one that actually is able to get adoption first wins. That becomes the default.
My answer is simple, and I think the question came over there, sorry, I can see, is you are. I mean, you are too, and I am as well. I actually think it's not one entity that's responsible for it. I think we have to collectively embrace in the areas that we work those standards and be opinionated. It's not going to be perfect, but I mean, our industry is not as large as we like to think sometimes, and so the more and more we communicate and the more we show examples and the more and more we start to decide on that together, then we could start up the standards bodies to make it documented.
So you're arguing the same as Yash?
Yeah, we are.
Okay, well, that's good to see.
QbDVision. No, I would echo what they said.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I think that you're making a choice with every technology you procure of what your data model will skew towards, and so like that's actually, I think, like the decision that you're making and going in eyes wide open. Like if you go in with a system that's highly configurable, you're making a decision to have a custom data model unless you bring some sort of external data model to apply to it.
I mean, I guess the pushback, Yash, around the standards body is Devendra's point around the active participation and ownership in that by the vendors. There are so many examples of pharma companies and industry bodies and opinionated individuals getting together but if you haven't got the vendors there, that's Devendra's point, and actually buying into it, because they've often participated in the meetings and then gone away and had their own roadmap of their own products and not done anything. So there's something in there, I think, that we need to think about.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the purpose of these kinds of venues, is right, to bring people together to have these conversations. But I think, to Chris's point, I think some of the groups just need to be a little bit more bold and say, look, we're not just gonna take input and then kind of put together a set of recommendations that kind of branch, right? You can go this way or you can go that way, right? I mean, I think there has to be somebody willing to put a stake in the ground and saying, this is a approach that we think the industry should move forward with, and then of course you will learn, right, as you move forward. Right.
More on data standards. Yeah.
A couple of comments on the challenges. So, as an analyst, I'll tell it the way I see it, right? And I think there are two big challenges. Number one is, from an industry standpoint, we still think we're so special and different and unique. And the way I do chromatography is so different than the way you do chromatography. And the way I run clinical trials. We need to recognize that in order to be able to adopt standards, to your point, we can't have custom data sets, or we can't have custom ontologies every time we implement the same system. From the vendor perspective, though, the challenge is many vendors will come up to industry and say, we're the only ones who can do this. If a vendor says we're the only one, walk away. Right? Because to Yash's point, it's a collaboration. So how do you think we address those two challenges that are hindering industry from adopting standards?
Hang on a sec.
Just to jump in real quick, I think a continuation of the last thought, from my experience, like I found myself being an organization that was probably mid-sized to small, like 5 years ago, and I felt frustrated by the inability to access certain ontologies and data models because we weren't in the cool kids club. because you had to pay, and they're driven by a lot of large organizations, right? And so I think that's another dichotomy that, by saying we own the data model, well, like if Pfizer generates the data model, it's definitely not going to work for startups.
Yep.
So it is a collaborative, and I think open sourcing first and foremost, and being willing to take that chance. And I think technology vendors have, an introspective decision to make around what they truly are differentiated on versus what they're willing to open to the community. And I think like part of that is being interoperable, right? So like we have, like it's not enough now to say we have a REST API. It's like, how much engineering resources do I need to bring to integrate system A with system X? I was joking around yesterday. It's like, well now, okay, every system's interoperable now, but now every system has a REST API, and now I need to hire like 5 to 10 data engineers just to like connect my ELN with my LIMS and my LIMS with my quality management system.
Yeah,
And I have to do it validated.
I think from a Thermo Fisher standpoint, I can say, Dan, that there is an increasing recognition that we don't need to build it all. That our role can be more, given our size, given our kind of presence, can be far more impactful in sort of curating that ecosystem. But it'll take time.
I think, the learnings from the instrument vendor world is a very relevant learning for this discussion, because if you look at our history together around just Agilent, Waters, PerkinElmer, and Thermo Fisher, there was no effort by any of those companies really of any substance to collaborate around standards. They met at meetings, they talked about it, but never happened. So I think your point about the sort of vendor buy-in, participation, seeing value, working out their differentiation and what their product does versus another product when standards exist is critical.
I want to add to that, Mike, because I think there is this perspective about the point that we're special. We are special, absolutely we are, but the reality is we're not special in every way. And I think we often try to blanket everything we do is proprietary, everything is unique, and in a lot of ways it's not. The way many industries have evolved is because they have identified those core capabilities. I'll be honest, AWS has been successful because we've democratized a lot of common generic standard technology so that everybody can have access to it. Where we want to keep moving, or we want to keep enabling, is the pieces that are less differentiated. Why can't we have a common language at which we get data out of the equipment? Is that really our secret sauce? Why can't we get a common language where data is going to be coming out of our CMC core model? It's not really our secret sauce. So I think it is a combination of identifying, and maybe this is where, picking a standard is an easy thing to say, but like committing to a standard and evolving that over time, because I tend to think we tend to jump, okay, we tried that one, didn't work, let's go try that one, it didn't work. Commitment's going to help us kind of evolve in the right direction.
Two more questions on.
I'm just going to comment on Dan's thing real quickly, and that is I think we are still a bit insular in the industry, right? So somebody's at Pfizer, they move to Merck. They move from Merck, they move to here, right? We don't get somebody who moves from KLA 10 core to Pfizer, right? Or moves from Samsung, semiconductors to, yes, we make complex things, coming from the world of optics where I used to be, that's my training. Making semiconductors is really hard, right? Doing lithography at extreme ultraviolet wavelengths is really hard, right? Building the James Webb Telescope is a really hard thing to do, right? Why don't we bring talent from other industries, right, to help us rethink what product quality actually means, right? Is it really about reducing the time to figure out your deviation, right? Or is it about not ever getting that deviation, right? So, I think these are the things that would help the industry better, evolve if they could do that.
Can I turn that back into a question, Mike, to the audience here, right? Do we think we do things in that space at scale, right? Because, or are we kind of plagued by a lot of what you're hearing is a lot of small scale experimentation and really not thinking about the scale?
Good question. I'm blind up here, so I'm doing this by sort of.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. On the point of standardization, the way I see it, I kind of step back from it a bit, and I believe that where the standardization needs to be is basically in those generic header fields, if you want to call it, right? You take a pH on the floor of a manufacturing space, that eventually goes into a batch record. That has contextual information around it. That same contextual information can be put to that pH measurement that's done in the QC lab. That same type of contextual information can be done to the person who is sitting in the R&D lab, the CMC R&D lab, trying to figure out how do I develop this process. Then you can have the arc of the story that goes with the idea behind QbDVision and some of the other applications that are out there. And I think if we talk about it in that way, we lower the volume around, or the noise around intellectual property and all of that, because we're talking about a piece of information that is usable and hits all those fair principles. And then the person who's in MSAC can say, all right, I want to see all the pH data that was here, and compared to what was on the floor and what was in the QC lab and what we got, because it has all those contextual pieces with it. So that's what I think of when I think of standardization. And maybe other people don't see it from that perspective, but as a user, that's how I see it. The other thing I wanted to bring up quickly before I pass the microphone up, to go back to something that Yash said about who are we talking to, which is not only the consumers, but also the health authorities. I, like most of you, read the news every day, see who got approved, who didn't get approved, who's got good news, who's got bad news. This year, I have seen more CRLs for CMC issues than I have ever seen. So I think that is a clarion call to all of us in this room, since this is digital CMC, that we got to step up our game. Because it used to be the only reason someone didn't get approved was the clinical reason. And now it's coming like a vengeance. We have to get our act together. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I can't see. Oh, one here. So one more question related to standards, and
I was trying to answer his question, if that's okay.
yeah, sure. Go for it.
Or at least aim to put a perspective to do we see scale, right? And from my street angle, right, within a company versus what's happening in industry, within a company, I have seen the difficulty of going up to scale, right? And that some of it linked to, again, the business, how the business travels. What is the governance of a pilot to a global, standard within a company. And that is, it's coming back to the business reality and how pharma is organized and how the governance across global versus local takes place, and where is that chain of command, and who, how is the top leadership versus, there's leadership at every level, right? So that is the dynamic of the scale, that if it's coming from the top down, it can be scale up. If it's coming from the bottom up, it's much more sequential. But there is also the influence of scale from pharma to pharma to pharma, and it's very interesting, that's driven for competitive advantages at the beginning, right? I remember Gloria talked about the digital twins, right? So that was one driver that came from outside pharma, start being implemented in pharma because, the Sanofi's, the GSK's first, I remember, came in with a digital concept. So I think there is not really a scale, but there is an impact of scale to the business, and I see it growing. Personally, I see it growing. Standardization is a different thing.
Thank you. Good, rich conversation on data standardization. Do we have one more? Yeah. Last one.
So this is just a comment, I think, at the scale as well. And I think I come from a discovery research scientist at the bench background. And for me, I think part of my DNA is to be innovative. And so sometimes it's at exact opposite odds of standardization. And so I think that's fundamentally, as an industry, one of the struggles we have is we want to be innovative. We need to be innovative. We're trying to solve challenges that have never been solved before. And so I think that's the exact opposite of standardization. And so I think that's one of our fundamental struggles as an industry.
Thank you.
And there are examples in which standardization didn't help long term, right? And there's equipment, platforms, standardization. And all of a sudden you find yourself locked into all eggs in the same basket, and there is a disruptive something in the technology, in the platform, and now it's very difficult to shift from, because you have the entire machines. Is the machine platform, for example.
One
so
more.
there is pros and cons.
One more.
I would just add here that...
Take the microphone so we can all hear.
I would just add here that companies are also interested to manage old data which are not structured yet. So how to approach this? You know, we have life cycle projects, and you will not just forget on old data. You still need this data. So how to address this?
Just put it on AWS. You knew I was going to say it. Right?
I think there's an important distinction we have to make here, and that goes back to Chris's point. Standardizing does not change your ability to innovate.
No,
right?
I agree. I'm just
Yeah.
saying there's a little bit of challenge there. I'm all for standardization. If you want to do science at scale, you have to have standards, right? I'm just saying it's in individuals, it's hard to reconcile that.
Yeah, but I think we're talking about standardizing the data model, right? So what Chris is saying is, and even with like if you have an HPLC, right? What you're interested in is what that chromatogram looks like, right? Why do you care, you know, how that data streams out, right? And so I think what we're talking about is, if you could standardize how that data streams out, right? You still get to see your chromatogram, you still get to interpret it the way you want to interpret it, but you know, if I can just hook it up in a way so that it just goes into where I need to go to, so you know, everybody's sort of looking at it the same way at least, right? Your interpretation is up to you. That's the distinction I think it's important to make. Right. And that's what we're talking about here is, you know, we're not saying that, you know, because people sometimes ask us this, like, oh, you have a list of product quality attributes. Can we change those? Well, yes, you can. We're not saying that you're fixed to these product quality attributes in our platform. We're just saying what you're fixed to is that we call it a final quality attribute, right? What you put in that bucket is what's relevant to your program. So that making that distinction is critical, because sometimes people they mix and match that, and I think that's the same thing Chris is saying.
So good rich conversation as always about data standards, and I think it unearthed absolutely every opinion as it always does. So that's wonderful progress. Thank you. We've got -0 minutes, and I still want to finish on a high point. So I'm going to ask one more question, and particularly encourage Yash to answer briefly. So assuming we actually get really good at this data stuff and this knowledge stuff, so everything we heard last night and this morning we've discussed, we actually get really good at it as an industry. What do your companies that you work for and you as individuals aspire to in 5 years? What does good look like in 5 years if we stop talking about all the challenges associated with data management and knowledge management, because we've got really good at those as practices? Who wants to start?
I can do it briefly.
No.
No?
You can't start. Chris?
Sure, I'll start.
Well, you're easier because it's just more on AWS, isn't it? It's just
My message is clear. It's probably more my opinion, because I think we do try to work backwards and try to understand what customers are looking for. But my opinion is that, you know, we have made that shift from what I think is a data focus, I think the first step, but to a state where we are actually achieving intelligence and leveraging tools to enable intelligence. And what that looks like to me, and maybe it's a little bit further out, is that it's just part of our DNA.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we tend to call this, the conference is a good example, we call it DigitalCMC. I'd like to see the point where it's just CMC. It's just part of what we do.
Mm-hmm. Good answer. Matt? What's good look like in 5 years?
Well, we talked about this. I think, you know, in 5 years, what good will look like is lowering the barrier to entry to do analysis and managing the understanding of like the process through things like ChatGPT and large language models. I think like we're going to be able, if organizations commit to it, they'll be able to lower the barrier to entry for, you know, scientific folks to be more technical.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's going to be a tension that's going to, I think you're going to be the haves and have-nots. So I think that's what we're going to have to overcome is how do we organizationally drive our talent and our people to upskill.
Mm-hmm.
So committing to organizations like, you know, IAAE and finding other opportunities to bring in more talent. You know, the last thing I'll end on is the average age of the workforce right now as a biotechnologist is 40 years old. They were born in 1982, and they were 25 years old when the iPhone came out in 2007. And the challenge we have is the workforce is aging, so we have to figure that out.
That was a negative note. That wasn't a positive.
But that's the challenge in front of us is like tackling those problems.
Glass is half empty. That's our industry. Devendra.
I think for me, what good would look like is you know, kind of codification of processes in digital platforms, right? However that happens over time, and the data foundation that sits underneath it is actually speeds up significantly execution of those processes. Mm-hmm. Whatever those are, wherever those are, you know, your ability, because I think I go back to Dan's point, at the end of the day, you're doing all of this to accelerate time to value to patient. Mm-hmm. And so if all of this is just about, yep, I've got access to information, but it doesn't materially speed things up, it doesn't actually mean much.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yash, final comment, Yash.
Yeah, I mean, two things. If you look at the number of drugs that are in shortage today because of product quality issues, 2/3 of drugs on the shortage list are because of product quality. 5 years from now, if we reduce that by 50%,
that'd be pretty cool.
Right? And the other thing is, if it takes 10 years to get the drug to market and it costs $2 million a dose, right? Let's get it to 5 years to market and $200,000 a dose.
Yep. Which might be the real answer to, you know, the challenge we posed last night around the Affordable Care Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the real answer. It's not actually just choose 50 drugs and pretend you're negotiating them. So fantastic point. So first of all, many thanks to all of you. You were interactive. I couldn't see you at all, so that didn't really help. But it did sort of work as I heard. So that was really good. So many thanks to all of you. That was interactive. That makes these panel discussions worthwhile for all of us. So many thanks. Please join me in thanking our panel for their time.